So this jig is my Screw Advanced box joint jig, and I thought I'd just build it again just to get more video of it. I made a one-to-one printout of the jig seen from the top. So I'm going to start by making this box. So I've just sized up the pieces for the box. I'm just going to cut a rabbet on here to match what I have in the plan. Well, these box parts match the plans pretty good, so I'm ready for glue up. While the glue for that is drying, I'm going to focus on making the front rail for the frame and some of the other parts for the frame. Those will be the part that goes along here, here, and here. This front rail has a big cutout in it right here, which is for mounting this piece in and providing a bit of relief for the gears. So here's my one-to-one, and it shows this cutout. I'm just going to put the piece of wood lined up with there, and I'll just mark it. Now the end of this end here is actually a bit thinner, so I have to thin that down a little bit. But before I do that, I'm just going to cut this slot here. I'm just going to mark it straight off the drawing. The slot is 1 centimeter deep, but because I'm going to cut 0.6 centimeters off of it, I'm going to set the table saw blade at 1.6 centimeters. So I've got parts of this frame cut, and I've got my rabbet cut. The next thing I need is there's a slot in here, and I've already marked where that goes right here. I'll just clean that out with a chisel. This slot really doesn't need to be super precise, it just needs to provide clearance for this bolt to slide back and forth. So the plans call for splines to be put into the corner of this box, and I'm just going to mark these straight off of my one-to-one drawings. And then I need to set the blade height just high enough not to get into the inside corners of the box here. I'm just going to move the fence from where the next one goes. So next I need to cut some strips of wood that will fit just snugly inside those slots. So I've done a few trials, and each time I move the fence by about 3 or 4 thou, checking it with this dial indicator. You don't want to cut these splines too thick. This one was a little bit tight and it got stuck, and I tried to drive it in with a hammer. So I've had some glue squeeze out on the inside, and I'm just going to use some sawdust to help clean that up. I just applied glue, and now I'm attaching a piece of hardwood to the one side of the box. So I've just created a hole with a ledge in it, and the narrow part of that hole is more than big enough for a nut that's going to go on the threaded rod. And on the wide side of the hole, the bearing fits in, but it only slides so far in because it ends up hitting that ledge in there. Now with the slot cut in there, when the bearing is in here, and I put a couple of screws in here to really squish this together, that bearing really gets locked in place. That beveled cut makes for a really sharp corner. So here's my beveled piece of wood, and to get the screw positions just right, I'm just going to mark them using my one-to-one drawing. So next I need to cut this notch out of here, and I've just marked on the workpiece where that notch goes. And here I'm just checking that for the vertical cut. Now for the other cut in this notch, this is at 30 degrees. So that looks like it should just cut away just right. Now this is not the safest cut because the blade will want to pull the stock towards it, so just to help me a little bit, I'm going to put a feather board here, and I'm also going to be very careful to make sure I keep this pressed against the fence. It has some friction, but that's actually very important so that the threaded rod and gearing backlash aren't going to affect the accuracy. There's a recess that needs to be cut into this box so that my T-nut mounting block can be further this way, just so that the carriage can come further that way. It's round this way, so I can just carve that out with a table saw. So the T-nut is going to get mounted roughly here, and the threaded rod goes through the T-nut, so I need to make a cutout here. So I've made a piece that matches this curve in here, so now placing that on here and trace the outline of that. The T-nut is supposed to go 1.9 from the end and 1.6 from the bottom. So right about here. So I've just drilled some holes in there for the prongs on the T-nut. So I'm just going to add a few more screws to this thing, hold that T-nut in place so it can't pull out when I rewind the carriage. So the next thing I need to make is the base for this, and I've already cut out a piece of plywood to match that shape, and I want to put that under here so I can punch all the screw hole positions through. And to do that, I'm going to cut this out. So I just drill these holes through and then countersink them from the other side. And now I'm ready to put this rail in place. And it's 12 millimeters from the edge all along. And now I can put screws in from this side. Next I can put this piece in place. Let's clamp that. Now because the piece I'm just adding is hardwood, I have to pre-drill for this screw. And finally we get to put this rail on. And now I have to measure very carefully to make sure it's going to be parallel. I put 2 screws in here as well. They have to be far enough down so that they're well below this gap. We don't want to screw into this gap or into the upper part because that would interfere with the clamping function. Now let's put this beveled rail on here. Now I can slide this box in, and I need to make sure it mounts so that this part here is exactly vertical. And now I need to mark a rabbet for this bar to fit into. And more importantly, the top edge. This rabbet needs to be a little bit wider than the rail just so it doesn't get stuck. Another really important check is that this slot here, which is going to be for the threaded rod, is going to line up with this hole here. So here's my slot cutout, and this bar here is going to ride in here. And I deliberately made that a little bit large. If we have a little bit of a gap down there, that means it's never going to jam up. The threaded rod goes through here and fits into this slot, and it goes through this T-nut in here, and it goes through a ball bearing in this hole. And if these two don't line up perfectly when they come together, that's going to prone to jamming up. I'm going to just check the alignment. I'm going to put the bearing in here, and just to avoid the bulk, I'm just going to use a 3/8 inch bolt. And now let's put this against here, and that looks like it's going to line up very nicely. I'm going to clamp it in place just by putting a C-clamp on there. The next thing I need to make is this idler thing, which has a bearing on it and hooks over this edge on here and keeps this pulled back on here. So I just used my 1-to-1 drawing. So that fits onto here, and I need to mount that bearing on here. And I'm using a relatively large screw because this screw isn't going to pull through. And another washer in here. It's going to get held down by a pair of wooden leaf springs that are going to stick into the box here. I'm going to have to cut the slot in here for those springs. I need to plunge cut into there with a table saw. So I'm going to basically mount that above the blade like so. And the blade needs to drop 4 centimeters into here. And let's count how many turns that takes to lower. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. If I crank it up by 10 turns, that's going to come up to the right height. I'm just going to use my feather board as a backstop. So the fence needs to be 3.1 centimeters from the blade. So that's right. That's right. So there's our slot. Now I need to actually double the width on that, so I'm going to move the fence by 2 millimeters. So here's the slot I just cut. Let's get the position for that hinge on here. And now I can just use some thin pieces of wood to act like a leaf spring, and that holds the carriage firmly against here. First, this gear and a T-nut go on here, and that actually gets pressed in the gear first, but right now I'm just putting it on loosely. Then a spacer, then the next gear, then 2 nuts, and then the ball bearing, and then another nut. From past experience, I found that the bearing on here centers much better if I put just a little bit of electrical tape onto the treads. Now an important test is if you hold it like that and spin it, that it all turns around nicely and that you don't feel the bearing wiggle. You can't really see it on the camera, but if I attach a piece of wood to it, you can see how that piece of wood wiggles back and forth. That's much better now. I'm going to have to chisel a little bit into here. So next I need to make this gear mount. It goes on here, slides back and forth, and it locks on here. I need to mark the line that goes along here. That's where I'm going to cut it open. That's also the line where this bolt goes in, and there's going to be 2 bolt holes, and the lateral positions for these is going to be here and here. So the holes I drilled are a little bit too large for this bolt. The idea is that this bolt goes in easily, but once I cut that slot out and I clamp those pieces together, that'll grab it nice and tight. So the next thing I need to do is cut this slot here, which allows this block to mount, and that goes halfway in between these two. So let's just transfer that mark. Let's see how it goes this far from the top. So here and this far down. So I've just drilled 3 overlapping holes in here. I need to cut this part off, which will be for clamping the bolt on here. So I just cleaned out that slot with a chisel. And now that bolt inserts here fairly easily, but when I tighten up on this knob, it's locked in tight. I still need to make a top for this block, so I'm just using the dimensions here. So I've just drilled the holes for my markings, and now I'm just going to put 2 bolts in here and clamp that down to make sure I've got the alignment right. So now let's screw that on here. Here I'm cutting out a big 48 tooth gear. I have a whole video on how to make gears, so I'm just going over this one relatively quickly. So this gear mount is in just the right height for engaging the 12 tooth gear back here, but to engage the 16 tooth, this needs to be raised up a little bit, and this is what this slot is for. I actually need to make a cut that's a bit wider than my saw blade, so I'm just going to move that fence by about 20 thou and then make another cut. So now with this tab in place, if I pull it away and engage it with the upper one, it's now lined up for engaging with the 16 tooth gear. Right now I get a 3-to-1, or I get 3/16 inch per turn, and with the gear in the lower position against the 12 tooth, I now have a 4-to-1, so each turn gives me 4 turns, or 1/4 inch. So depending on which gear and how many turns I put on per cut, I can already get a lot of different spacings. But for my other jig, I've actually already made a large number of other gears, which allow me to create just about any spacing that I want to by varying the number of turns. So using my 1-to-1 printout again, and I'll mark where the screws are supposed to go. Now I'm going to attach this flat bar using some number 10 machine screws, like one of these. And I'm always having a hard time starting this at the right angle, so I made a little guide block. So the next thing I need to work out is where to put the guide bar on this jig. The distance between the blade and the bar slot is not the same on every table saw. And with this carriage cranked all the way to the left, this blade is just right of this part here. I now know that the guide bar needs to go here. Now I can just use a framing square. So here's my guide bar, and I'm going to use that to mark the holes. So I'll mark an X on here just by scratching it in, and I'll put that X on here as well. And making the X face the X, we'll always put it down this way. Yeah, that's still square. And now I'm going to use these holes to mark through where the holes. I'm using this block of wood with a V in it just to help me get that hole started. Now with the metal bar again, my X is here, and here's the other X. And those holes, no matter how inaccurately I drilled them, should line up. Both of those screws are actually underneath this part and that part of the carriage, so they're not going to interfere with the stock that slides back and forth. Well, this jig is almost complete. There's just one more step left to be done, and that's to cut a slot in the base. And now it's done. If you'd like to build this jig, I have a very detailed set of plans for sale on my website, and also a longer 4-part video series on how to build it.